They found a 1967 Shelby GT500 in the woods. What was inside made the mechanic cry. In the dense woodlands of rural Tennessee, brothers Jake and Tommy Miller discover what appears to be an abandoned 1967 Shelby GT500 Eleanor, one of the most coveted muscle cars in American automotive history. What begins as an exciting barn find turns into an emotional journey when they bring the car to veteran mechanic Frank Garrison's shop. As Frank begins the restoration process, he uncovers personal items hidden within the vehicle that reveal the heartbreaking story of its original owner, a Vietnam War veteran who never made it home. The discovery connects 3 generations of men through shared loss, healing, and the unbreakable bonds forged by both war and the love of classic American muscle cars. If these stories moved you, imagine what's coming next. Subscribe to Rust and Memory, because some engines don't just start cars, they start memories. Chapter 1. The Discovery in Cumberland Woods. The October morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Cumberland County, Tennessee, like a soft gray blanket, slowly lifting as the sun climbed higher through the canopy of oak and maple trees. The air carried that crisp bite of autumn, mixed with the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and the distant smoke from someone's chimney. Jake Miller adjusted his worn baseball cap and shouldered his hunting rifle, following the narrow deer trail that wound deeper into the woods behind his grandfather's old property. "You sure Granddad said we could hunt back here?" His younger brother Tommy called out, his voice slightly winded as he struggled to keep up. At 19, Tommy was still filling out his lanky frame, unlike Jake's more solid build, earned from 5 years working construction after high school. "He said anywhere on the property," Jake replied, pausing to let his brother catch up. "Besides, he's been wanting someone to walk these back trails. Said he hasn't been out here in probably 15 years, not since his knees started giving him trouble." The brothers had grown up spending summers at their grandfather's place, a modest farmhouse sitting on 43 acres of mixed farmland and dense woodland. But like many rural properties in Tennessee, parts of it had been left to grow wild over the decades. What had once been cleared pasture was now thick with saplings and underbrush, creating a natural sanctuary for deer, turkey, and the occasional black bear. They'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when Tommy suddenly stopped, tilting his head. "You hear that?" Jake paused, listening. Through the normal sounds of the forest, birds calling, leaves rustling, the distant creek babbling, there was something else. A metallic creaking, rhythmic and faint, like old metal swaying in the breeze. "Probably just an old fence line," Jake said, but his curiosity was piqued. "Let's check it out." They pushed through a particularly thick stand of young pines, their boots crunching on the carpet of fallen needles. The metallic sound grew louder, and suddenly Tommy grabbed his brother's arm. "Holy shit, Jake, look at that." 20 yards ahead, barely visible through the tangle of vines and small trees that had grown up around it, was the unmistakable silhouette of a car. Not just any car, but something with the long, aggressive lines of a classic muscle car. The creaking sound was coming from what looked like a makeshift tarp, now mostly rotted away, that was still partially attached to the vehicle and swaying in the gentle breeze. "No way," Jake whispered, his heart starting to race. He'd been a car enthusiast since he was old enough to hold a wrench, spending countless hours in garages and at car shows with his Uncle Pete. "Tommy, that looks like a 67 or 68 Mustang. Maybe a fastback." They approached carefully, as if the car might vanish if they moved too quickly. Vines had grown up through the wheel wells and around the bumpers. Small trees had sprouted nearby, and the forest floor was thick with decades of accumulated leaves. But as they got closer and Jake began pulling away some of the vegetation, his hands started to shake. "Jake," Tommy said, his voice tight with excitement, "look at the side of it, those stripes, and that scoop on the hood." Jake's breath caught in his throat. Even under the layer of moss, dirt, and rust, he could make out the distinctive racing stripes running down the center of the car. And that hood, that wasn't just any Mustang hood. That was the functional ram air scoop of something very, very special. "Get your phone out," Jake said urgently, starting to clear more vegetation from around the front of the car. "We need pictures of this." As they worked to uncover more of the vehicle, Jake's suspicions were confirmed. The front grille, though damaged and partially obscured by rust, had the distinctive look of a Shelby. The fog lights were still mounted in the lower grille opening, and when he managed to clear enough dirt and leaves from the front fender, his heart nearly stopped. There, barely visible under the grime and oxidation, were the Cobra emblems and GT500 badging that confirmed what he'd hardly dared to hope. "Tommy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "this isn't just any Mustang. This is a Shelby GT500, a real honest-to-God Eleanor." Tommy looked confused. "Eleanor? The car from Gone in 60 Seconds, man. But more than that, this is one of the rarest, most valuable muscle cars ever made. If this is really a 67 GT500, and if it's got the original drivetrain." Jake trailed off, doing quick math in his head. Even in rough condition, if this car was authentic, it could be worth anywhere from $100,000 to $300,000, depending on what shape the numbers-matching components were in. They spent the next hour carefully documenting everything they could see, taking photos from every angle and trying to peer inside through the grimy windows. The interior was a mess of rotted upholstery and accumulated debris, but Jake could make out what looked like the original 4-speed shifter and the distinctive Shelby dashboard layout. "We need to tell Grandad," Tommy said finally, "and we need to figure out how to get this thing out of here." First things first," Jake replied, already planning in his head. "We need to figure out who owns this car and how it ended up back here. Grandad's owned this property since the late 60s, but that doesn't mean this car was abandoned here. Could have been stolen, could belong to someone who had permission to store it back here and then forgot about it or died." The walk back to their grandfather's house seemed to take forever, both brothers buzzing with excitement and speculation. Harold Miller was sitting on his front porch, a cup of coffee steaming in his weathered hands, when they came bursting out of the tree line. "You boys look like you seen a ghost," he said with a chuckle. "Deer not cooperating today?" "Grandad," Jake said, still breathing hard, "we found something back in the woods, something big. There's a car back there, a 1967 Shelby GT500, just sitting there, been there for God knows how long." Harold's expression changed, the smile fading from his face. He set his coffee cup down carefully on the porch railing and was quiet for a long moment. 1967, you said?" "Yes, sir. GT500, with the racing stripes and everything. It's in rough shape, but Grandad, if it's real and the motor's still good—" "I know what it is, boy," Harold said quietly. He stood up slowly, his arthritic knees protesting, and looked toward the woods. "Wondered if anyone would ever find that old car." Jake and Tommy exchanged glances. "You knew it was back there?" Harold nodded slowly. "Been back there since 1969, near as I can figure. Belongs to a boy named Danny Kowalski. Good kid. Grew up just down the road from here." He paused, his eyes distant. "He left for Vietnam in 68, never came back." The weight of Harold's words settled over the brothers like a cold blanket. Suddenly, their exciting discovery took on a completely different meaning. "What happened to him?" Tommy asked quietly. "Killed in action, February 1969. Up near the DMZ, his mama told me. He'd only been in country about 3 months. Harold's voice was heavy with old sadness. That car was his pride and joy. Saved up for 2 years working at the mill to buy it. Had plans to race it at the local track when he got back from the war. Jake felt his throat tighten. How did it end up back in our woods? Danny's dad brought it back here maybe a month after they got word. asked if he could store it somewhere on the property, said he couldn't stand to look at it every day, reminded him too much of his boy. I told him he could put it anywhere he wanted for as long as he needed. Harold shook his head. That was 54 years ago. Danny's parents both passed in the 80s, no other family that I knew of. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Jake spoke up. "Granddad, what do you think we should do with it?" Harold looked at his grandsons, seeing the excitement still there, but tempered now with respect and understanding. "Well," he said slowly, "way I see it, that car's been waiting a long time for someone to care about it again. Danny loved that car more than just about anything. Seems to me he'd want it to be running again, being appreciated, not just rotting away in the woods." "You mean we should restore it?" "I think you boys should do whatever feels right, but if you're going to bring that car back to life, you better do it right. Danny deserves that much." Jake nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. But first, they needed to get the car out of the woods and to someone who could properly assess what they were dealing with, and he knew exactly who to call. Frank Garrison had been working on classic cars in Cumberland County for 40 years. His shop, Garrison's Classic Restorations, was legendary among muscle car enthusiasts throughout the Southeast. If anyone could tell them what they really had and what it would take to bring it back to life, it was Frank. "I'll call him tomorrow," Jake said. "See if he can come take a look or if we can get the car towed to his shop." As the sun set behind the Tennessee hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the 3 generations of Miller men sat on the porch, each thinking about the young man who'd never made it home from a war that had ended before Jake and Tommy were even born. Somewhere back in those woods, covered in vines and rust, Danny Kowalski's dream car waited for its second chance at life. Chapter 2. Frank Garrison's Assessment. Frank Garrison's garage sat at the end of a gravel road about 10 miles outside of Cookeville, Tennessee, surrounded by the rolling hills and farmland that defined this part of the Cumberland Plateau. The building itself was an old dairy barn that Frank had converted in the early 80s, its weathered siding and metal roof giving no hint of the treasures being restored inside. Hand-painted signs along the drive warned visitors that this is a working shop, no tours, no exceptions. But the sound of classic rock drifting from the open bay doors and the gleam of chrome visible in the shadows drew car enthusiasts like moths to a flame. At 68, Frank had hands that told the story of 4 decades working with metal, grease, and machinery. His fingers were permanently stained with oil, crossed with scars from sharp edges and hot metal, but they could diagnose an engine problem by touch alone and coax life back into the most hopeless restoration projects. His reputation extended far beyond Tennessee. He'd restored cars for collectors in Nashville, Atlanta, and even Hollywood, but he'd never moved his shop from the rural land where he'd grown up. The phone call from Jake Miller had intrigued him. Frank had known Harold Miller for years, had even done some work on Harold's old Chevy pickup back in the 90s. But it wasn't every day someone called claiming they'd found a '67 GT500 abandoned in the woods. Frank had heard similar claims before, usually from people who'd found rusty Mustangs and hoped they were sitting on a gold mine. More often than not, they were regular fastbacks or coupes that optimistic owners had tried to convert to Shelby clones over the years. But something in Jake's voice had convinced him to make the drive out to Harold's property with his heavy-duty wrecker. Maybe it was the kid's obvious knowledge of cars, or the way he'd carefully described specific details only someone familiar with real Shelbys would notice. Or maybe it was just Frank's eternal optimism that the next barn find would be something truly special. The recovery operation had taken most of the morning. Getting a flatbed wrecker back through the woods to where the car sat had required cutting a path through smaller trees and carefully winching the Shelby onto the trailer without causing more damage to its already compromised body. Frank had done a quick initial assessment while they loaded it, enough to confirm that this was indeed a genuine GT500 and not a clone. But the real evaluation would happen back at his shop. Now, 2 days later, Frank stood in his main bay, staring at what might be the most significant barn find of his career. The Shelby sat under the bright LED work lights he'd installed throughout the shop, every detail of its condition visible for the first time in 54 years. "Jesus, Danny," Frank murmured to himself, running his hand along the driver's side door. "What the hell happened to you, boy?" He'd known Danny Kowalski, though not well. Frank had been 26 in 1968 when Danny shipped out, already married with his first kid on the way, working as a mechanic at the Ford dealership in town. But Cookeville was small enough that everyone knew everyone, and Danny had been hard to miss. A good-looking kid with an infectious laugh and an absolute obsession with fast cars. Frank remembered him hanging around the dealership, asking questions about the new Mustangs and dreaming out loud about what he was going to do with his car when he got back from his tour. The GT500 was rough, no question about it. 5 decades of Tennessee weather had taken their toll despite the partial shelter of the forest canopy. The paint was mostly gone, replaced by surface rust that had eaten through to bare metal in several places. The chrome bumpers were pitted and dull, and the iconic side scoops were clogged with decades of accumulated debris. But as Frank began his systematic inspection, he found reasons for hope. The body was surprisingly solid. The floor pans, always the first thing to rust out on cars stored outdoors, had some surface corrosion but no major holes. The frame rails looked good, and when he climbed underneath with a flashlight, he could see that the suspension components, while seized with rust, were all there and appeared to be original. More importantly, the numbers were matching. The VIN on the dashboard corresponded to a genuine 1967 GT500, and when Frank checked the engine block, the casting numbers confirmed it was the original 428 Police Interceptor V8 that had left the Shelby facility in 1967. The transmission was the correct 4-speed manual, and even the rear differential appeared to be the original 3.89 traction lock unit. "You beautiful bastard," Frank whispered as he copied down the VIN and engine numbers. According to his reference books, this particular GT500 was one of only 2,048 built in 1967, making it rarer than many exotic cars. In perfect condition, it would be worth upwards of $400,000. Even as a restoration project, it was worth more than most people made in several years. But it was when Frank began clearing out the interior that the real discovery happened. The seats were ruined, of course, the original black vinyl cracked and split, stuffing spilling out where mice had made nests over the decades. The door panels were warped and water-damaged, and the dashboard had cracked in several places. But as Frank pulled out the larger pieces of debris, he found something that made his heart skip a beat. Wedged behind the driver's seat, wrapped in what had once been a heavy plastic bag, was a manila envelope. The plastic had protected it from the worst of the moisture, and when Frank carefully opened it, he found a collection of documents that told the story of the car's original owner. There was the original title, made out to Daniel J. Kowalski, with an address on Elm Street in Cookeville. The purchase paperwork from Hal Jackson Ford, showing that Danny had paid $4,235 for the car in March of 1967, a substantial sum for a 20-year-old mill worker, equivalent to nearly $40,000 in today's money. There were receipts for modifications, headers, a cold air intake, drag racing slicks, and a higher stall torque converter. But it was the personal items that hit Frank like a punch to the gut. There were letters from a girl named Susan, postmarked from Nashville, where she was apparently attending nursing school. The letters were full of young love and future plans, dreams of marriage, of the trips they'd take in the Shelby when Danny got back from Vietnam, of the children they'd have, and the house they'd buy with the money he was saving from his army pay. There was a photo of Danny and Susan standing next to the freshly washed GT500, both of them laughing at something off camera. Danny looked impossibly young in his army dress uniform, home on leave before shipping overseas. Susan was beautiful in that wholesome, all-American way that defined the late 60s, her blonde hair styled in a perfect flip, her smile radiant with happiness and hope for the future. And there was one final letter, dated January 15th, 1969, from Susan. Frank's hands shook as he read it. "Dear Danny," it began, "I know you're probably surprised to hear from me after our last letter, but I had to write. I'm getting married next month to a doctor I met here in Nashville. I know this isn't what we planned, and I know it's not fair to you, especially while you're so far from home, but I can't wait anymore. I can't live my life on hold, wondering if you're coming back, wondering if things will ever be the same between us. I hope you can understand. I hope you can be happy for me. I'll always remember the good times we had, and I'll always love that part of you that made me feel so alive. Please be safe and come home soon. Love always, Susan." The letter was postmarked February 3rd, 1969. According to Harold Miller, Danny had been killed in action later that same month. Frank sat down heavily on his work stool, the letter still in his hands. In 40 years of restoring classic cars, he'd found plenty of interesting things hidden in old vehicles, money, jewelry, forgotten photographs, but he'd never found anything quite like this. He was holding the physical remains of a young man's dreams, the artifacts of a life cut short before it had really begun. "Mr. Garrison?" Frank looked up to see Jake Miller standing in the doorway of the shop, Tommy beside him. They'd called ahead to say they were coming by to check on the car's condition. "Boys," Frank said, quickly composing himself and sliding the letter back into the envelope. "Come on in. I've got some news about your grandfather's Shelby." For the next hour, Frank walked them through his assessment. The good news was that the car was definitely authentic and restorable. The bad news was that it would be an expensive and time-consuming project. Even doing as much of the work as possible themselves, they were looking at $50,000 to $80,000 in parts and professional services, and at least 2 years of steady work. "But here's the thing," Frank said, leaning against his workbench. "This isn't just any GT500. This car has a story, and that story makes it special in ways that go beyond just dollars and cents." He told them about finding the envelope, about the letters and photographs, about the young man who'd loved this car so much that he'd hidden away pieces of his life inside it before leaving for a war he'd never returned from. "What happened to Susan?" Tommy asked quietly. "Don't know," Frank admitted. "Probably married that doctor, had kids, lived her life. That's what people do. But Danny never got that chance." Jake was quiet for a long moment, walking around the car, taking in its condition with new eyes. Finally, he looked at Frank. "What would you do if this was your decision?" Frank smiled, the first real smile he'd felt since finding the letters. "Son, I've been restoring cars for 40 years, and I can tell you that every car tells a story. But most of those stories are about success, about people who had the money and time to buy beautiful machines. This car tells a different story. It tells the story of a young man who worked hard, saved his money, bought his dream car, and then gave his life for his country before he ever got to really enjoy it." He paused, looking at the rusted but still noble lines of the GT500. "If it was my decision, I'd bring this car back to life. Not just restore it, but make it better than it ever was. Make it the car Danny dreamed it could be, because that boy deserves to have his dreams come true, even 54 years later." Jake nodded slowly. "What about the cost?" "Well," Frank said, "that's where I might be able to help. I've got a son, Michael, who's been working with me for about 10 years now. He's a hell of a body man, and he's been looking for a special project to really showcase his skills. If you boys are willing to put in the sweat equity, and I mean a lot of sweat equity, We might be able to work out a deal that makes this possible. The negotiations took another hour, but by the time Jake and Tommy left the shop that evening, they had a plan. Frank would provide the expertise, the shop space, and much of the labor at cost. The Miller brothers would source parts, handle much of the disassembly and preparation work, and learn every aspect of the restoration process along the way. More importantly, they had agreed on a goal that went beyond just restoring a car. They were going to honor Danny Kowalski's memory by making his dream car everything he'd ever hoped it could be. As Frank locked up the shop that night, he took one last look at the GT500 sitting under the lights. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. They'd start by completely disassembling the car, cataloging every part, assessing what could be saved and what would need to be replaced. It would be months before the car looked like anything other than a pile of parts. But Frank had done this enough times to see past the rust and decay. In his mind, he could already see the finished product. Gleaming Wimbledon white paint with Guardsman blue racing stripes, chrome bumpers polished to a mirror finish, the 428 V8 rebuilt to produce even more power than it had originally, the interior restored with modern upgrades that Danny would have loved. More than that, he could imagine Danny's reaction if he could somehow see what they were about to do. The kid who'd never gotten to drag race his car, never gotten to take his girl for drives in the country, never gotten to grow old with the machine he'd loved so much. His car was about to get a second chance at life. And maybe, Frank thought as he turned off the lights and headed home to his wife, that was the best kind of restoration there was. Chapter 3. The Restoration Begins. The Tennessee spring arrived early that year, with the dogwoods blooming by the first week of March and the morning temperatures climbing into the comfortable 60s. Frank Garrison's shop had become a second home for Jake and Tommy Miller over the winter months, as they spent their evenings and weekends learning the intricate process of automotive restoration. The disassembly of Danny Kowalski's GT500 had taken 3 months of careful work. Every bolt, every component, every piece of trim had been removed, catalogued and assessed. Frank had insisted they document everything with photographs and detailed notes, creating a roadmap that would guide them through the eventual reassembly process. Most people want to rush this part, Frank had explained as they carefully removed the engine. They see a pile of rusty parts and just want to get to the fun stuff, the painting, the chroming, the final assembly. But this stage is where you really learn the car. Every scar tells a story. Every modification shows you what the original owner was thinking. And Danny Kowalski had definitely been thinking about performance. As they stripped down the 428 V8, they discovered that it wasn't entirely stock. Someone, presumably Danny himself, had installed a more aggressive camshaft, ported and polished the cylinder heads, and added a dual-point ignition system. The modifications were period-correct and well executed, the work of someone who understood both engines and racing. Kid knew what he was doing, Frank's son Michael observed as he examined the engine block. At 35, Michael Garrison had inherited his father's eye for detail and his skill with metalwork, but he'd also embraced modern technology in ways that sometimes frustrated the older mechanic. These head modifications would have added maybe 40 horsepower over stock. Combined with those headers we found, this thing was probably putting out close to 400 horses. Jake ran his hand over the disassembled engine components, trying to imagine Danny working on these same parts 54 years earlier. The young soldier had probably spent countless hours in his driveway or a friend's garage, dreaming of the day he'd get to really open up this motor on a drag strip or empty country road. "What kind of power can we get out of it now?" Tommy asked. "I mean, with modern technology and everything?" Frank and Michael exchanged glances. They'd been having this conversation for weeks, debating how far to go with the engine modifications. The purest approach would be to restore everything to exact original specifications, preserving the car as a historical artifact. But Danny's own modifications suggested he wouldn't have been satisfied with stock performance. Well, Frank said slowly, we could keep Danny's modifications and just freshen everything up. New pistons, rings, bearings, gaskets. That would give us a reliable 400 horsepower engine that would run for another 50 years. Or, Jake prompted, sensing there was more. Michael grinned. Or we could give Danny the engine he probably dreamed about but couldn't afford back in 1967. Modern forged internals, computer-designed camshaft, fuel injection, electronic ignition. We could probably get 500, maybe 550 horsepower out of this block without compromising reliability. The decision came from an unexpected source. Jake had been going through more of Danny's papers, which Frank had carefully preserved and stored in his office. Among the receipts and letters, he'd found a notebook filled with Danny's handwriting, page after page of calculations, plans, and dreams for his car. One page, dated December 1967, just before Danny shipped out, was particularly revealing. At the top, Danny had written, "When I get back, GT500 upgrades." Below that was a detailed list. Holly 750 double pumper, aluminum intake manifold, roller cam, forged pistons, 4.11 rear gears, subframe connectors, roll cage for track use. Jake showed the notebook to Frank and Michael. Looks like Danny was planning to build exactly the kind of car you're talking about. He just never got the chance. Frank studied the young soldier's careful handwriting, his meticulous research into performance modifications. "Son of a bitch," he said quietly. "Kid was serious about racing this thing." "So we build it the way he would have," Jake said. "Not just restore it, but finish what he started." The decision made, they threw themselves into the project with renewed energy. Frank contacted suppliers across the country, sourcing the best possible components for the engine rebuild. Michael began the painstaking process of restoring the body, cutting out the rusted sections and fabricating new metal pieces to replace them. The work was physically demanding and emotionally intense. As they stripped layers of rust and old paint from the body panels, they uncovered evidence of Danny's life with the car. There were small dents from normal use, a carefully repaired scratch on the driver's door, and even some graffiti scratched into the paint. DK plus SM. Inside, a heart, obviously carved by a young man deeply in love. "Susan Martinez," Tommy said when they found it. "Remember from the letters? That must have been her maiden name." Jake nodded, running his finger over the faded carving. They'd read all of Susan's letters by now, with Frank's permission. The early ones were full of love and excitement, but the later ones showed growing uncertainty and fear as the war dragged on, and Danny's letters from Vietnam became less frequent and more distant. "Think we should try to find her?" Tommy asked. "Let her know about the car?" Frank considered this. Might be worth doing some research, but carefully. She's probably got a whole different life now. Might not want to be reminded of something that happened 54 years ago. As spring turned to summer, the restoration gathered momentum. The bodywork was the most challenging part, requiring Michael's full expertise and Frank's decades of experience. They decided to paint the car in its original Wimbledon white with Guardsman blue racing stripes, but they were using modern paint and clear coat that would provide better protection and a deeper finish than anything available in 1967. The engine rebuild was progressing beautifully. Frank had found a machine shop in Nashville that specialized in vintage Ford V8s, and they'd worked magic with Danny's old 428 block. Bored .030 over and fitted with forged pistons, a steel crankshaft and modern bearings, the rebuilt engine would be virtually bulletproof, while producing the kind of power Danny had only dreamed about. But it was the small details that really brought the project to life. Jake had located a company in California that reproduced original Shelby interior components, and they'd ordered a complete interior kit in the original black vinyl. The seat covers, door panels and dashboard pad would be identical to what Danny had known, but with modern materials that would last decades longer than the originals. Tommy had become obsessed with researching the car's racing potential. He'd found documentation showing that several GT500s had been campaigned successfully in SCCA road racing and NHRA drag racing during the late 60s. Danny's notebook contained detailed weight distribution calculations and suspension geometry notes that suggested he'd been planning to road race the car as well as drag race it. "Look at this," Tommy said one evening, showing Jake and Frank a page from Danny's notebook. He was planning to install a roll cage and racing seats. Even had contact information for a guy in Nashville who built cages for Mustangs. Frank looked at the page, then at the car, which was now stripped down to bare metal and looking more like a sculpture than an automobile. "You know what? Let's call that guy in Nashville, or whoever's running that shop now. If we're going to finish Danny's dream, we might as well do it completely." The decision to install a roll cage and other racing modifications pushed the project into new territory. They weren't just restoring a car anymore. They were building a tribute to a young man's unfulfilled dreams. Every component choice, every modification, every detail was guided by the question, what would Danny have wanted? The answer seemed to be everything. Danny's notebooks revealed a young man who'd studied every aspect of automotive performance, who'd saved money not just to buy his dream car, but to make it the best it could possibly be. He'd researched suspension modifications, aerodynamic improvements, and even weight reduction techniques that wouldn't be widely adopted until years later. As summer turned to fall, the GT500 began to look like a car again. The body was finished in stunning Wimbledon white paint, so deep and glossy it looked like you could swim in it. The Guardsman blue racing stripes were perfect, applied by a specialist who'd painted dozens of original Shelbys during his career. Chrome that had been pitted and dull was now polished to a mirror finish, and new rubber gaskets and seals ensured everything would fit perfectly. The engine was a work of art. The rebuilt 428 sat on an engine stand in Frank's shop, every component polished or painted. The modern fuel injection system hidden beneath an air cleaner that looked completely stock from the outside. On the dyno, it had produced 547 horsepower and 580 foot-pounds of torque, numbers that would have seemed impossible in 1967. But the most emotional moment came when they installed the interior. As Jake carefully fitted the new seat covers over the restored frames, he found something that had been hidden inside the original stuffing, a small jewelry box wrapped in oilcloth and tucked deep inside the driver's seat. Inside the box was an engagement ring. Frank looked at the small diamond solitaire, simple but clearly chosen with care and love, and felt his throat tighten. "Son of a bitch," he whispered. He was going to propose to her. The ring was accompanied by a small note in Danny's handwriting. "For Susan, when I get home, DK, January 1969. Danny Kowalski had hidden an engagement ring in his car just before shipping out to Vietnam, planning to propose to his girlfriend when he returned from the war. Instead, he died in a foreign jungle while the ring waited in darkness for someone to find it 54 years later. Jake stared at the note, feeling the weight of all those lost dreams, all those unfulfilled plans. "Jesus, Frank, what do we do with this?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, turning the small box over in his weathered hands. "I think," he said finally, "it's time we tried to find Susan." Chapter 4. The Emotional Reunion. The search for Susan Martinez, now Susan Martinez Phillips, took Jake Miller 3 weeks of careful detective work. He'd started with the return address on her final letter to Danny, then traced her through nursing school records, marriage certificates, and eventually social media. What he found was a 73-year-old retired nurse living in Franklin, Tennessee, about an hour south of Nashville, with her husband of 52 years, Dr. Robert Phillips. The phone call had been awkward at first, How do you explain to someone that you found their first love's car in the woods, along with personal letters and an engagement ring they never knew existed? Jake had been careful, gentle, explaining about the restoration project and emphasizing that they simply wanted to honor Danny's memory. Susan's initial reaction had been shock, then tears, then a long silence. When she finally spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "I haven't thought about that car in decades," she said. "Danny loved that thing more than anything, maybe more than he loved me." Now, on a crisp Saturday morning in late October, exactly 1 year after Jake and Tommy had first discovered the GT500 in the woods, Susan Martinez Phillips stood in the doorway of Frank Garrison's shop, staring at the completed restoration with tears streaming down her face. The car was magnificent. Every surface gleamed under the shop lights, from the flawless Wimbledon white paint to the polished chrome bumpers. The Guardsman blue racing stripes ran down the center of the car like twin lightning bolts, and the iconic Shelby Cobra emblems seemed ready to strike. But it was more than just beautiful. It was alive in a way that transcended mere mechanical restoration. "Oh my God," Susan whispered, her hand pressed to her mouth. "It's exactly like I remember it, but better. So much better." Her husband Robert stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, providing silent support as she processed the flood of memories and emotions. They'd driven up from Franklin together that morning, both curious and apprehensive about what they might find. Frank approached them carefully, holding the small jewelry box in his hands. At 73, Susan was still a beautiful woman, her silver hair perfectly styled, her posture erect despite her years. But in her eyes, Frank could see the young nursing student who'd loved a soldier boy and his dream car more than half a century ago. "Mrs. Phillips," Frank said gently, "there's something else we found. Something I think Danny would have wanted you to have." He handed her the small box, and Susan's hands shook as she opened it. When she saw the engagement ring nestled inside, her knees buckled slightly, and Robert had to help steady her. He bought me a ring," she said, her voice barely audible. "There was a note with it," Jake said, stepping forward. "He was planning to propose when he got back from Vietnam." Susan stared at the ring, tears falling freely now. "I never knew. In his last few letters he seemed so distant, so different. I thought he was pulling away from me, that maybe he'd found someone else, or just didn't want the same things anymore." Frank nodded, understanding. "War changes people, Mom. Sometimes the only way they can cope is to try to protect the people they love by pushing them away. Doesn't mean he loved you any less." Jake had done more research into Danny's military service, contacting the Department of Defense and tracking down members of his unit who were still alive. What he'd learned painted a picture of a young man who'd volunteered for increasingly dangerous missions, who'd stopped talking about home and future plans as he became more and more convinced he wasn't going to survive the war. "His sergeant told me Danny carried your picture everywhere," Jake said quietly. "Said he talked about you and the car constantly during his first few months in country. But after Christmas of '68, he got quiet. Stopped writing letters, stopped talking about coming home. The sergeant thought maybe he'd received a Dear John letter." Susan's face crumpled. "He did. Oh, God, he did. I wrote him that letter in January, telling him I was marrying Robert. I thought he didn't want me anymore. I was so scared, so alone. Robert was there. He was safe. He was real. Danny felt like a dream I'd had once." Robert squeezed his wife's shoulder. They'd talked about this on the drive up, about the young woman she'd been, and the impossible choices the war had forced on an entire generation. He bore no resentment toward Danny's memory. How could he resent a young man who died serving his country? "You did what you thought was right," Frank said. "You were just kids, both of you, trying to navigate something no one should have to go through." Tommy had been standing quietly near the car, but now he stepped forward. "There's something else," he said. We found his notebooks, all his plans for the car. He wasn't just restoring it, he was building it into something special. A race car, a show car, something that would have been incredible. He gestured toward the GT500, and for the first time, Susan really looked at what they'd accomplished. The car was clearly far beyond anything that had existed in 1967. The wheels were modern racing pieces, perfectly proportioned for the car's aggressive stance. The exhaust system was a work of art, polished stainless steel that would produce a sound like thunder. Through the open hood, she could see an engine bay that was detailed to concession-level perfection. "We built it the way Danny planned to," Jake explained. "Used his notes, his research, his dreams. It's got a 547 horsepower engine, a 5-speed transmission, modern suspension, racing brakes. It's everything he wrote about wanting to do to it." Frank walked over to the car and opened the driver's door. The interior was stunning. Black leather seats with Shelby snake emblems, a roll cage that had been integrated so seamlessly it looked like original equipment. Modern gauges that maintained the classic look while providing contemporary functionality. "We'd like you to start it," Frank said to Susan. "If you're comfortable with that. Danny would have wanted you to be the first person to hear this engine run." Susan looked uncertain. I don't know if I can. It's been so long." "It's just like riding a bicycle," Jake said with a gentle smile. "The key's in the ignition." With Robert's help, Susan slid into the driver's seat. The interior smelled of new leather and careful craftsmanship, but underneath those scents was something else, the indefinable essence of a classic car, the mixture of metal and oil and possibility that had attracted enthusiasts for generations. The key turned easily, and modern fuel injection meant the engine caught immediately. But the sound that filled the shop was pure 1960s American muscle, a deep, aggressive rumble that spoke of horsepower and torque, and the kind of performance that could pin you back in your seat. Susan sat behind the wheel, eyes closed, listening to the engine settle into a smooth idle. For a moment, the decades melted away, and she was 20 years old again, waiting for her soldier boy to come home from war so they could take his dream car and drive off into their future together. "He would have loved this," she said finally, opening her eyes and looking around at the restored interior. "He would have been so proud of what you've done." She climbed out of the car, and Frank shut off the engine. The silence that followed seemed profound, weighted with emotion and memory. "There's one more thing," Jake said. "We've been talking, Frank and Michael and Tommy and me, about what to do with the car now that it's finished. And we think Danny would have wanted it to be more than just a showpiece." He explained their plan. They wanted to campaign the GT500 in vintage racing events, drag races and car shows throughout the Southeast. Not as a museum piece, but as a living tribute to Danny Kowalski, a young man's dreams finally realized 54 years after his death. "Every time we race it, every time we show it, people will learn Danny's story," Tommy added. "They'll know about the soldier who never came home, who loved this car so much that it waited for him in the woods for half a century." Susan was quiet for a long moment, walking slowly around the car, taking in every detail of the restoration. Finally, she stopped in front of the car and looked at the men who had brought Danny's dream back to life. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "Something I've never told anyone, not even Robert." She looked at her husband, who nodded encouragingly. "When I wrote that last letter to Danny, the one where I told him I was marrying Robert, I lied about one thing. I said I didn't know if he was coming back, that I couldn't wait anymore. But the truth was, I knew. Somehow I just knew he wasn't coming home. Call it women's intuition, call it whatever you want, but I knew." She wiped tears from her eyes before continuing. "I married Robert because he was a good man who loved me, and because I needed to build a life with someone who was going to be there to share it. But I never stopped loving Danny. Not the way you love your first love, the person who shows you what's possible, who makes you believe in magic." She placed her hand on the GT500's fender, the metal warm from the engine heat. This car was Danny's magic, his way of believing that the future could be everything he dreamed it would be. And now, because of what you've done, that magic is real again. Frank stepped forward. So we have your blessing to race it, to share Danny's story? Susan smiled through her tears. You have more than my blessing. You have my gratitude. Danny's been waiting 54 years for someone to finish what he started. I can't think of anyone better to do it than the people who found him in those woods. As the afternoon sun slanted through the shop windows, casting long shadows across the gleaming GT500, the small group stood together in comfortable silence. Outside, the Tennessee hills were dressed in their full autumn colors, gold and red and orange, painting the landscape in the same hues that had welcomed Danny Kowalski home from basic training in 1967. The restoration was complete, but in many ways, the car's real journey was just beginning. In a few weeks, Jake would trailer it to its first car show, where hundreds of people would admire the craftsmanship and hear the story of the young soldier who'd never gotten to enjoy his dream car. Later, Michael would take it to a drag strip, where the carefully tuned 428 would finally get to stretch its legs, the way Danny had always planned. But for now, it was enough that the car existed again, that Danny Kowalski's dreams had been given physical form by the hands and hearts of people who understood what it meant to love something enough to bring it back from the dead. Frank walked over to his workbench and picked up a small plaque he'd had made. The brass plate was engraved with simple words, "In memory of PFC Daniel J. Kowalski, 1948-1969. His dreams live on." He handed it to Jake. "For the dash," he said, "so everyone who drives this car knows whose dream they're living." As Susan and Robert prepared to leave, Susan turned back one last time to look at the GT500. "Danny," she whispered, so quietly that only she could hear, "I hope you know how much you were loved. I hope you know that your dreams came true after all." The autumn wind rustled through the trees around Frank's shop, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves, the eternal cycle of seasons that connects all things. Somewhere in those woods behind Harold Miller's property, in the place where a young man's dream car had waited patiently for more than half a century, the October light filtered through the branches exactly as it had on the day two brothers went hunting and found something far more valuable than any deer. The 1967 Shelby GT500 sat in Frank Garrison's shop, gleaming under the work lights, ready to fulfill its destiny. Danny Kowalski's war had ended in a jungle halfway around the world in 1969, but his dreams had found new life in the hands of people who understood that some things are too precious to let fade away. But the most meaningful moment was yet to come. 3 months later, on a warm February morning that would have been Danny Kowalski's 75th birthday, a small convoy made its way through the winding roads of Cumberland County. Frank's truck pulled a trailer, carrying the fully restored GT500, followed by Harold Miller's pickup with Jake and Tommy, and behind them, Robert Phillips's sedan with Susan as his passenger. Their destination was the Cumberland National Cemetery, where Danny had been laid to rest after his body was returned from Vietnam in the spring of 1969. The simple white headstone bore his name, rank, and the dates that bookended his brief life, along with the bronze star he'd earned for valor during his final mission. Frank and Jake carefully unloaded the Shelby, and for the first time since its restoration, the car sat on hallowed ground where Danny's physical remains rested. The morning sun caught the Wimbledon white paint and made it seem to glow against the perfectly maintained grass of the military cemetery. Susan approached the grave slowly, carrying a bouquet of white roses. She hadn't visited this place in decades, hadn't been able to bring herself to face the finality of that simple stone marker. But today felt different. Today, she had something to give back. "Hello, Danny," she said softly. kneeling to place the flowers against the headstone. "I brought some friends to meet you, and I brought your car." She told him about the restoration, about the men who had found his dream in the woods and refused to let it die. She told him about the engine that now produced more power than he'd ever imagined possible, about the racing victories to come, about the shows where his story would inspire other young dreamers. And finally, she told him about the ring. "I would have said yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If you had come home, if you had asked, I would have said yes. I want you to know that. I want you to know that you were loved enough for a lifetime, even though your lifetime was so short." Frank started the engine, and the sound of the 428 V8 echoed across the quiet cemetery like a prayer made of steel and horsepower. Other visitors turned to look, some with disapproval at first. But when they saw the obvious reverence of the moment, the way the small group stood in respectful silence around the grave, their expressions softened. Jake had researched the other names on nearby headstones, other young men from Cumberland County who had died in Vietnam. There was Michael Torres, killed 3 weeks after Danny. Robert Washington, who had died in the same engagement that claimed Danny's life. Thomas Chen, shot down over North Vietnam in 1970, boys who had become men in the crucible of war, then died before they could fully live. This isn't just about Danny, Jake realized, looking at the rows of white stones. This is about all of them. All the dreams that died with them. Frank nodded, understanding. Every generation has its war, son. Every generation has its young men who don't come home. But sometimes, once in a while, we get a chance to keep their dreams alive. Over the following months, the GT500 became a rolling memorial. At car shows throughout Tennessee, Kentucky, and Georgia, crowds would gather to admire the restoration, but they stayed to hear Danny's story. Veterans would approach with tears in their eyes, sharing their own stories of friends who hadn't made it home. Young people would listen with fascination to tales of a different era, when muscle cars ruled the streets and young men went to war with nothing but hope and determination. The car won awards everywhere it went, but the trophies weren't the point. The point was in moments like the one at the Nashville Superspeedway, when an elderly veteran approached Jake in the pits. "I served with a Danny Kowalski," the man said. "Different unit, but we were in the same AO for a while. Good kid, always talking about some car he had back home." The veteran's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Never knew what happened to him after February '69. Glad to know someone remembered." Nor the moment at the Shades of the Past Hot Rod show in Pigeon Forge, when a young soldier home on leave from Afghanistan stood staring at the GT500 for nearly an hour, reading every word of Danny's story on the display board Jake had created. "Makes you think," the soldier finally said, "about what really matters, about what you're fighting for." The racing proved even more meaningful than the shows. Michael Garrison had become the car's primary driver, and his skill behind the wheel honored Danny's memory with every lap. At the Vintage Grand Prix at Road Atlanta, the GT500 finished third in its class, the 547 horsepower engine pulling hard down the back straight, while the modern suspension and brakes kept it competitive with cars costing 10 times as much. But it was at the NHRA divisional drag races where the car truly came alive. The quarter-mile times Danny had dreamed about, 12s, maybe high 11s if everything went perfectly, became effortless 10s. The first time Michael piloted the car to a 1050 at 128 mph, Jake felt certain that somewhere, somehow, Danny Kowalski was grinning from ear to ear. Susan attended many of these events, sometimes with Robert, sometimes alone. She had become the unofficial keeper of Danny's story, able to share details about the young man behind the machine that brought the legend to life. Her presence lent authenticity to the tribute, a living connection to the love story that had inspired the restoration. On a particularly memorable day at Bristol Dragway, a young woman approached Susan after watching the GT500 make a pass. "Mrs. Phillips," she said, "I'm a nurse at the VA hospital in Johnson City. I work with veterans who are struggling with PTSD, trying to find their way back to civilian life. Do you think, would it be possible to bring Danny's car to the hospital? I think some of our guys would really connect with his story." That visit led to others. The GT500 became a regular fixture at VA hospitals, veterans reunions, and military memorial services throughout the region. Each appearance reinforced the message that sacrifice is never forgotten, that the dreams of those who gave everything for their country can still inspire new generations. 2 years after the restoration was completed, on Memorial Day weekend, the largest gathering yet took place at the Tennessee State Veterans Cemetery in Nashville. More than 300 cars attended the show, but the GT500 held the place of honor, parked beside a memorial wall bearing the names of Tennessee's fallen heroes. Frank Garrison, now 71 and thinking more seriously about retirement, stood beside the car with Jake, Tommy, and Michael. The restoration had changed all of them in ways they were still discovering. Jake had left his construction job to open his own classic car restoration shop, with Frank as his mentor and partner. Tommy had enrolled in automotive technology school, inspired by what he'd learned working on Danny's car. Michael had taken over more of the daily operations at his father's shop, allowing Frank to focus on the special projects that meant the most to him. "You know what the best part is?" Frank said, watching a group of children climb on the running boards of a nearby '69 Camaro while their veteran grandfather told them stories. "Danny's car isn't just a memorial anymore. It's proof that dreams don't die, even when the dreamer does. It's proof that there are people in this world who care enough to finish what someone else started." As the sun set behind the Nashville skyline, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange that reminded everyone present of the eternal beauty of the Tennessee landscape, the GT500 sat gleaming in the fading light. Its story had become part of automotive legend, featured in magazines, documentaries, and social media posts that reached enthusiasts around the world. But for those who had lived the story, who had been touched by the discovery and restoration of Danny Kowalski's dream car, the real meaning was simpler and more profound. They had kept faith with a young man who had died far from home, ensuring that his dreams lived on long after his death. They had proven that love, for country, for dreams, for the memory of those we've lost, is stronger than time, stronger than death, stronger than the rust and decay that try to claim all beautiful things. The 1967 Shelby GT500 Eleanor would continue to race, to show, to inspire, carrying Danny's story to new audiences and new generations. And somewhere in the Tennessee hills, in the place where it all began, the woods behind Harold Miller's property stood as a reminder that sometimes the most incredible discoveries are waiting in the most unexpected places, hidden beneath years of neglect, but never truly forgotten. Danny Kowalski's war had ended in 1969, but his dreams had found new life in the hands of people who understood that some things are too precious to let fade away. The restoration was complete. But the real journey, the journey of keeping memory alive, of honoring sacrifice, of proving that dreams never truly die, would continue for as long as people remembered the young soldier and his beloved car. In the end, that was Danny's greatest victory, not the horsepower or the trophies or the magazine features, but the simple fact that 54 years after his death, people still cared enough to keep his dreams alive. And in a world that often seems to forget its heroes too quickly, that was a restoration worth more than any car, no matter how rare or valuable. The GT500's engine started with its familiar rumble, and as the convoy prepared to leave the cemetery, Frank took one last look at the memorial wall. Thousands of names, thousands of stories, thousands of dreams cut short by the ultimate sacrifice. But today, at least one of those dreams lived again, polished and powerful, and ready to inspire anyone with eyes to see and heart to understand. Danny Kowalski was finally home. The end. Thanks for watching. Some cars come back to life. Others bring someone back with them. See you in the next story, right here on Rust and Memory.